are going to move on and we are going to see that how translation theory evolved and kept on evolving and developing, and what happened exactly in 20th century. So somebody wants to join. So if you remember the point where we stopped last week on the line on the on-campus class was in terms of talking about these particular terms, which are related to faithfulness, fidelity, spirit, and truth. So these were the three terms: faithfulness, fidelity, that is, faithfulness stands for fidelity, spirit, and truth. Now, class, you can refer to page 5 of your handout, and this is the first paragraph at the top of the page. I'm going to refer to basically Lewis Calley's the True Interpreter, in which Lewis looks at the history of translation theory. As you know, so far you've understood that we, in terms of tracing out the history and the contribution of different people in terms of their role in evolving of this particular translation studies and its interpretation and how it evolved. So Lewis Calley, in the True Interpreter, looks in detail at the history of translation theory, starting with the teachings of writers in antiquity. I talked about writers of antiquity, tracing from Horace and St Jerome, and in terms of and Seshora, how they started off originally when it started from 1st century onwards and all that. So today I'm just going to focus upon these three terms: fidelity, spirit, and truth. So the first concept regarding fidelity, as all these three concepts, they are tangled with each other. They are closely tied with each other. That means one concept related to another. They're closely tied with each other: fidelity, spirit, and truth. So the concept of fidelity, or at least the translator calls it, it basically stands for the term the faithful interpreter. So it stands for, as I said, the literal word for it basically stands for the word a person who a translator's job is to be a faithful interpreter. By interpreter means that you need to understand the concept, the content, what it is. And this was, although initially dismissed as literal word for word translation by Horace, but then towards the end of the 17th century, fidelity really came to be identified with faithfulness to the meaning rather than the word. So as the concept changed and as the development came, it was felt that now it would moved on. By faithfulness would mean that it is more faithful to the meanings rather than the words. The actual words of L1 or the source text were there, but what was more important was the meanings behind those words. So the focus for this is being to be faithful interpreter, to be able to understand what it meant, the text stood for, what was the meaning, what did it imply. That was more important than for kind of word for word translation. So this was the first concept, fidelity, that is faithful interpreter. Then we move on, and Kelly, this is in the middle of this paragraph, Kelly describes spirit. This is the second word, and this implies that it having two meanings. The Latin word spiritus denotes creative energy or inspiration proper to literature. So the Latin word spirit would stand for creative energy proper to literature, but it would also mean to the Holy Spirit, to the, in terms of the sacred aspect related to that, to the concept, because, this is, when we're talking about these terms, these are basically related in terms of translating of sacred texts, in particular, Holy Bible. And truth, the third concept, was intertwined, and the truth having the sense of content. So the third concept of truth, that is fidelity, spirit, and truth stood for the actual content. That whatever you translate, the truth meant you're translating, it should be authentic, it should be close to the actual text. This is what St. Jerome also implied. For him, truth meant the authentic Hebrew text, because he was actually translating the Holy Bible, and for him, the truth meant the authentic Hebrew text of Bible, how it was to be translated. So Kelly considers that it was not until the 20th century that truth was fully equated with content. Later on, it became equated with the exact word content, but in St. Jerome's time, it stood for being authentic, very close to the actual authentic Hebrew text. So these three terms, I repeat again, fidelity, spirit, and truth, they're intertwined, they are closely related with each other, one leading to another. But basically, Callie's important contribution in terms of translation studies was the way these three concepts were linked together in Callie's theory. And he initially basically described about as being as a, bringing this concept fidelity with faithful interpreter, spirit as having the creative energy, and the third truth with the content or being the authentic. So all three concepts merge together in the theory propagated by Kelly. So it is easy to see how, um, in translation of sacred texts, where the word of God is paramount, where the word of God is paramount, there has been an interconnection of fidelity to both the words and the perceived sense. So we have to see that in these sacred texts and Bible in particular, the word of God is of great significance, and that's why all the more importance on paraphrasing or in terms of translating, and not even misquoting or misuse of any word at all, because for all the reasons being sacred texts, this was a great, duty ordained on the translators to come up with the job of translation, translating the sacred texts. So for them, each word of the Holy Bible was like the word of God, and it was of paramount, of great importance. So there has been an interconnection of fidelity to both the words and the perceived sense as well. So not actually the word, but also the sense which is related to that. Each word was also equally important. And spirit is this energy of the words and the Holy Spirit. So what does each word convey? The connotation, the energy of the words and the Holy Spirit. That means, the Holy Spirit means the God and what's related with that, and said, and that the truth stood for the actual content. So all these three aspects in Kelly's work, they were all to be incorporated and they were intertwined. So as it moves on, however, by the 17th century, even the term fidelity had come to be generally regarded as more than just fidelity to words, and and spirit lost the religious sense it originally possessed, and was thenceforth used solely in the sense of the creative energy. Though later on, as the time went on towards 17th century, these terms fidelity and spirit, they kind of lost their original the the concept or the terms for which they stood for. They were slightly modified round about 20th century. So fidelity lost its more than it was regarded fidelity towards it generally it lost, and similarly spirit lost the religious sense it was associated with, and then so we could talk about the sense of creative energy of a text or energy. So this was in terms of in 17th century the contribution of Louis Kelly in particular in the true interpretation and how translation was looked upon with the help of these three terms. Now I'm going to move on and have a look at what John Dryden and his contribution in the development of systematic translation theory. Now you're aware of John Dryden, a great critic, a great name in English literature, and apart from being a theorist and a critic, his important role here is that as being a translator, his stance or his stature as a translator, and his contribution at bringing or evolving translation theory more into systematic theory instead of having at random things coming up. Things needed to be systematized, more organized, and so that things are put properly in a proper sequence. Okay. So with this comes, if you look at your handout as well on page 5, so these attempts were made apart from Dryden, other theorists like Dewlett and Tytler. We look at them each one by one, But first, I'm just going to focus upon Dryden. And Dryden, in his preface to his translation of Ovid's epistles, when he translated them in 1680, he, according to him, he reduces all translation to three categories, because being a theorist and a critic, he penned down each thing, his theories in black and white, clearly. And this is what he said. Now, let me read one paragraph, and then I'm going to these three translation or three categories. But let me just read out that what was happening in what particular time Dryden was working, and how did he come up with his theories. You can look at page 5 of your notes. For Amos, the England of the 17th century, with Denham, Cowley, and Dryden, marked an important step forward in translation theory with their deliberate, reasoned statements, unmistakable in their purpose and meaning. At that time, translation into English was almost exclusively confined to verse renderings of Greek and Latin classics, some of which were extremely free. So, if we look back at that time, that is around about 17th century, what was happening at that time was that basically the translation was fixated, or it was related, or it was confined to uh, uh, verse renderings. That means poems and verse renderings in Latin and Greek language, and the way they were translated into English. So, at that time, the translation, as you see now, has moved on from earlier on, when it started off with just with the sacred book, though, the Bible. Now, translation had moved on in England, and at that time, translation has moved on basically to literature and literary renderings. And in particular, in 17th century, translation was focused upon renderings of both verse renderings, both in Greek and Latin language. As you know, these are the two classical languages. So from there, they were translated. But the mode of translation, or I should say, the style of translation, was extremely free. There were not any such rules or anything. It was like because they were basically translating verse renderings. So it was they were the people who were translating, or the translators were given a free hand to come up with their translation with a free hand. Cowley, for instance, in his preface to Pindaric Odes, attacks poetry that is converted faithfully and word for word into Italian. So these theorists, apart from Dryden, Cowley, he believed that he was fiercely attacked, and he was not in favor of having a faithful word for word translation into either French or Italian prose, because he somehow felt that these people in this century, basically, they believe that what was important was the essence. What was important was in terms of giving a free hand to the translator, and see for yourself that what was the actual content or the essence of that verse which was translated. So they converted faithfully and word for word into French. So Cowley, who did it in Pindaric quotes, he attacked poetry initially in which word for word, translation was used, especially in French or Latin prose. So he also cited in Amos, and his approach is also to counter the inevitable loss of beauty in translation by using our wit or invention to create new beauty. So in doing this, Cowley admits he has left out and added what I please to odes. So, he tries to justify his approach, and he says that according to him, he feels that there's inevitable loss of the beauty in translation. Okay, please hold on. Okay, are you all listening? You have all got your handouts with you, class?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Okay, then just be quiet and be attentive. So you all have your handouts with you as well. I'm just explaining at the moment from the handout. I'm going to come to these 3 points, metaphrase and others, after I have giving you the introduction to the others, and then going to move on to these three categories which Dryden presented. Okay. So, as I talked about Cowley and his justification, and he moved on And then another aspect which Cowley presented was he used the term imitation. Now, imitation, as you know, the word imitate means that it is not actually the actual thing, but it's an imitation. It's, you can say it's a copy. When you try to copy something, when you try to imitate something, that is an imitation. So Cowley even proposes the term imitation for his very free method of what he means to say is that you have to keep in mind as a translator, your job is to, to imitate, to copy the actual text, okay, in translation. So the idea is not so, as in the Roman period, that such a free hand would enable the translator to surpass the original. So you are copying it, but at the same time, you aren't given that much of a free hand that you actually try to surpass even the original writer and coming up with your interpretation in such detail that the translated text becomes more, I should say, a kind of far away from the actual text. So this you have to keep in mind that whatever you're doing, it has to be confined. When there is anything which, when you're imitating something, that always confines that it's something related with the actual. You're not allowed to go beyond the limits of the actual. So imitation is the term which Cowley uses for that. Okay. So, as a free approach to translation produced noticeably from another English poet, so John Dryden came up with his translation process, and his process basically he reduces all translation to the three categories, and now I'm going to come to them one by one. The first category proposed by Dryden was metaphrase. The word metaphrase or this category for Dryden implied word by word and line by line translation, which corresponds to literal translation. So for Dryden, the first aspect to translation was fixed to metaphrase. By metaphrase, he implied that it is either word for word and line by line translation, and which again corresponds to the a kind of a literal translation, because when you are meticulously following each word by word and line by line translation, that means what you're practicing is the literal translation. Then the second category put up by Dryden was paraphrase. Now, paraphrase, as the term implies, it meant translations with latitude, where the author is kept in view by the translator, but his words are not so strictly followed. So his sense, uh, this involves changing whole phrases, but corresponds to faithful or sense for sense translation. So paraphrase, Dryden's strategy of paraphrase was related with this, that he believed that translations with latitude. Latitude means that you're kind of giving some freedom. You're giving some freedom or free hand to the translator. So where the author is kept in view by the translator, but his words are not strictly followed. So a translator who's translating, say, a poem or a story, would always keep the author in mind. Obviously, that person translator is translating, but then is not thinking that this translation version would be word for word and strictly following that. What is important was that the translator should be given a latitude or should be given some freedom to go about. So this freedom would entail, as a sense, this involves changing whole phrases, but corresponds to faithful or sense for sense translation. So what it implied that these translators were given this freedom to change. They could change whole phrases of the actual text, the source text. But what it would still imply was that at least they would, the language was their own. Naturally, when they were using their own language, English language for translation, the phrases would also be changed. They will not stand word for word as in the source language, but it would correspond to faithful, and it would correspond that they are faithfully following the meaning or sense for sense translation. So what they are following, again, the essence of being faithful to the actual source text, that is ST. So I hope by now you're familiar with these two, three terms which I keep on repeating throughout this book, SL stands for source language, and TL stands for target language, and ST stands for source text, and TT stands for target text. So these are the terms which are repeatedly used in all books by written on translation studies, because they are like codes. They are implied. They are used by as short word terms of abbreviations in any translation book which you're going to read, and you should be clear about them. Okay. So let's move on to the third.
Ma'am,
Yes. Okay.
ma'am, can you please repeat the term metaphrase, what it meant?
Okay. Let me first finish imitation. Have you joined just now?
No, ma'am, I was listening, but I'm not, I can't, I am unable to make a connection
Okay,
for
first
that.
let me finish imitation, then I'll repeat all these three again for all of you. Okay, the third concept of imitation, this is again refers to Dryden's, the way Dryden has reduced all translation to three major, important, main categories. Okay, imitation. So let's see imitation. What imitation? Again, imitation from the word actual, what it stands for. So it for him it implied forsaking both words and sense. This corresponds to Cowley's free
Excuse me,
translation
ma'am.
and is more or less adaptation. Okay, let me finish. Let me finish first, then I'll
Ma'am,
explain.
please move the slide.
I can't move the slide. Hold on, I'm on this slide, so how can I go back? This is this is point number three, imitation. Just be patient. Don't you have your notes with you in front of you, by the way? This whole note, this आपके पास ये chapter 2 के notes आपके सामने होने चाहिए. Always keep them. This is I'm still at this is the chapter number 2, translation theory before 20th century. उसको सामने रखें और ये मेरी जो slides चल रही हैं, shouldn't be a problem at all. Okay, anyway, imitation basically means this is Dryden refers back to Cowley's concept, which I've just explained now. That for imitation, let me explain again. When you talk about the concept of imitation, what is imitation? What do you when you imitate somebody, आप क्या कोशिश कर रहे होते हैं? You're trying to copy it, isn't it so? Because the original is already there. Original तो original है. Imitate तो आप किसी चीज की copy कर रहे हैं. So this is what imitation means. That for Dryden as well, he refers back to the concept of Cowley, who had presented this idea of imitation, that as a translator, you are even leaving behind the words and sense of the actual original text. But what you're doing is, as a translation, is more or less an adaptation of the source टेक्स्ट. जो आपने शॉर्ट स्टोरी या वर्ड्स को ट्रांसलेट कर रहे हैं, आप you're forsaking, आप उनको छोड़ रहे हैं. You're leaving behind words and sense. And what you are actually doing is, as a translator, you are copying the actual जो जो वर्ड्स है या स्टोरी है, उसको जब आप कॉपी करते हैं तो इट्स मोर और लेस you're trying to adapt. You're trying to adapt. It's your adaptation. That means कि जो आपको समझ आ रही है उसको आपने कैसे उसको अडेप्ट करके पेश कर दिया, that what it implies. Okay, so now if you feel like, I'll go back to these three concepts again, and please be all of you be attentive this time again. I know this is hard stuff. That's why I gave you this actual notes as well. Get used to read this text thoroughly, only then you will understand the jargon of translation studies. This is a new discipline for you, so you need to work hard for this. Okay, and the more you read, once, twice, thrice, things will be clear to you. Okay, now I'm just repeating this again, and this is the last time as well. So we are talking about John Dryden's contribution, in particular in the development of a systematic translation theory. I won't go back. We have already done in the first 4 lectures regarding how translation studies evolved. Here we are in 17th century, 1680, when John Dryden, he came up and he reduced all translation to 3 categories. Before that, you can refer to your notes on page number 5. The earlier people who came in 17th century, Cowley, what was his contribution? His contribution was the word which I explained just now, imitation, and it moved on. But now we'll just concentrate on John Dryden and his 3 categories. Okay. So when you talk about the first category, Now, let me explain to you one thing as well. When these people, theorists, come up with their own interpretations, their categories, they come up and they at a certain point in time like 1680 में उसने ये तीन categories दे दी. But it might happen that as he gains more experience in translation, he might revise them as well. अब ये नहीं है कि whatever he said in the first category metaphrase अब वो उस पे ही उसके साथ stuck हो गया. So don't get confused. This is what happens with theorists. की किताबें भी तो आपकी छपती हैं, first edition, second edition, उसी text को. What happens is even these writers, when they write up, come up with their first textbook, उसको लिख लिया, publish होगी, इतनी hundreds and thousands of copies get published. But then as there are theorists, as there are experts, I should say linguists हैं, academia से है, they learning is a process. It's an endless process. They in fact अपनी work में उनको कुछ गलतियां नजर आती हैं, अपनी work में shortcomings, and they feel that no, this should be something like this, and then they come up with their second edition of the book. Second edition would have the basics of all the first book, but then their own revision changes. So same is the case. Don't get with if Dryden is saying something in these categories, or because बाद में आगे मैं पढ़ाऊंगी that he might come up with something new as well. So we are basically at the moment bothered about कि उसने Ovid's Epistle 1680 में ये तीन categories दे दी. वो क्या थी? वो ये है. Metaphrase, word by word and line by line. तो पहला उसका आइडिया था कि इस तरह ट्रांसलेशन होनी चाहिए. मेटाफ्रेज इज जस्ट अ वर्ड कि एक ट्रांसलेशन ऐसे ही होनी चाहिए, वर्ड फॉर वर्ड, लाइन बाय which conference, so it would be very close to the literal translation. Got it now, class? I hope it's clear to you now. Okay, right. Okay, fine. Let's
Yes.
move on. Okay, that's good. Now the paraphrase. This is, ये तीनों categories में वो कुछ थोड़ी सी different बात कर रहा है. So don't get confused. The second category he talks about paraphrase. So for paraphrase for Dryden was translations with latitude. अब इसको अगर आप पिछले वाले से देखेंगे, यहाँ कुछ फर्क बात हो रही है. He says that now he's saying that translation would imply that you are giving this latitude. This latitude means freedom. You're giving this freedom to the translator. That where the author is kept, that the translator keeps the author in mind, but the translators can strictly follow his own sense, and he can also change whole phrases. He's not bound के literal word for word जो कि उसने पहले वाली category में metaphrase में कहा था कि word for word, line by line. Now he's saying that it could be anything. You can change whole phrases as well, but as long as you are faithful to the actual text, मतलब आपका content वही होना चाहिए what the actual writer is trying to say. Okay. And the third category he talks about is imitation. An imitation, for this I explained to you the Cowley's concept was in terms of copying. So imitation, that means you can even leave both words sense, and this would basically imply correspond to what Cowley's pre-translation was, is that anybody who is translating anything is basically reading thoroughly what that text is about, and then whatever you understand, your adaptation of the text is what it means. So these were the three categories which initially Dryden talked about. Okay. Now let
So
me
then,
move.
ma'am, in the imitation, there will be no faithfulness.
Now, we are
If
not here. Hold on. We are not here to debate and turn down that Dryden was no good or what he talked about. These are kind of theoretical bases. You are being presented with the theories related to that. You are not in a position to come up with a critique at the moment. Okay, this can be later on when you become translators yourself. Here we are talking about these theories. You should know the distinction between these three terms. Okay, and let's move on. Okay, because I have to finish this topic in today's class. Now you can refer to page 6 of your handout, and let me explain from there. So, as I said, that even these theorists, renowned people, right, Dryden, what they said once, they can also change as they revise, as they come up with the more, I should say, when they read in detail and they come up and they refine their own work as well. Okay. Okay. So, Dryden criticizes translators such as Ben Jonson, who adopts metaphrase as being a verbal copier. So, he says, what happens, I just now said, that Dryden himself later on, because he was a critic as well, then he translate and he criticized other renowned translators like Ben Jonson, and he says, what are they doing? They are copying, they're adopting metaphrase, that they're just like verbal copies. Such servile literal translation is dismissed with now famous simile. It is much like dancing on ropes with fettered legs the full. So you see, even Dryden, what he said in his first category, kind of denies or kind of changes. So that is what it is, the way theory was moving. Similarly, Dryden rejects imitation. Now, later on, he rejected his third category as well. He rejects imitation, where the translator uses the ST, source text, as a pattern to write, as he supposes that author would have done had he lived in our age and our country. So sometimes he says that even the third category, imitation, also kinds of rejects it, and he says that this would also suppose that maybe the author would have this would mean that the author maybe, because translation is something, when I give the introductory lecture, this is like the job of the translator is also like a person who is preserving history. Why I'm saying using the history or preserving literature? Because translation is not confined to translation at the moment. Anybody could come up and translate a short story written, say, 50 years back or in the last century. So this is an ongoing process. But a translator of 21st century who's living in 21st century, having this orientation of 21st century, age of globalization, naturally the age in which this particular translator is living has a deep impact on the psyche, on the persona of this translator, and is trying to translate, say, 50, 60 years old text. तो उसकी कुछ तो उसकी impact आएगा, the way this person of this generation, this age thinks about it. So this is what Dryden talked about. He rejects imitation, and he says, where the translator uses the source text as a pattern to write, as he supposes that author would have done had he lived in our age. And then the person who is doing it now would say, as if the author, and when the author wrote, that was a previous century, a different age, a different country, different language for that matter. So that means, according to him, even imitation is not, it doesn't have it's too much of its applicability. Imitation, in Dryden's view, allows the translator to become more visible, but does the greatest wrong to the memory and reputation of the dead. So he denies himself, and he says, so if the imitation is the theory, would basically means that the translator is becoming, the role of the translator is becoming more visible, because when you're giving this free hand to the translator, he can come up with their own adaptation of the actual text. So what they're actually doing is that they are becoming more visible, but they're doing one great wrong, because the dead person, the writer who actually wrote, say, a century back, you are just is putting his repetition at one end. So even this particular theory of imitation, he tries to prove later on, is that he feels that he kind of should I say, puts it back of his mind as he moves on. And then what he says next, he said, Dryden thus prefers paraphrase, advising that metaphrase and imitation be avoided. So he himself denies, and he says the best thing would be leave aside these two theories of metaphrase and imitation and move on and come and see and prefer paraphrase. Okay, this triadic model proposed by Dryden was to exert considerable influence. And what is paraphrase? Just a question for you as well. By paraphrase, I'm sure these are terms of your age. What is paraphrase? When you paraphrase a point, are you all listening?
Ma'am,
Good.
in paraphrase, we just change the structure, we change the position of a verb or object, but the meanings still remain the same.
Okay. So that means you are, whatever, say, if you're asked to paraphrase the stanza of a poem, nobody's expecting you to use the same words. So you would be
Yes.
paraphrasing it. One thing is the way you have understood, okay, because and then you come up. So Dryden also prefers paraphrase, and he advises that you leave aside metaphrase and imitation to be avoided and move to this concept. So let's see what paraphrase is. So this triadic model proposed by Dryden was to exert considerable influence on later writing. So he moved on, although this three model, which I repeat again, metaphrase, paraphrase, imitation, which he actually presented his main theories in 1680. He says that it did influence, it was proposed by him, and it had a considerable influence on later writings, on translations which were being carried around in his age. Yet it is also true that Dryden himself changes his stance. So this is what we have concluded, that he himself also changed his stance, and then later on with the dedication in his translation of Virgil's Aeneid. So because Dryden's contribution was apart from a critic, but as a theorist, he was a renowned translator as well. So as he moved on and he's translated, and basically he translated classics, Greek and Latin translate, classics. So when he translated Virgil's Aeneid, and again he showed stance in this translation, he showed a shift to the point between paraphrase and literal. So when he translated Virgil's Aeneid, he showed he moved towards more towards paraphrase and literal, a kind of an in between thing, in between paraphrasing and literal translation. Because paraphrasing again would be something like what you understand of the poems or what it do they stand for, and literal would be the word for word. So, and what does he say here? I thought fit to steer betwixt the two extremes of paraphrase and literal translation. So keep as near my author as I could, without losing all his graces, the most eminent of which are the beauty of his work. Then he himself, in say round about 16, 1970, it's almost like the end of 17th century, he says that now I would like to move on and try to explain the two extremes of the paraphrase. And then he says that I basically believe that it should be in between. It should be also something of paraphrasing that means giving free hand to the persons to come up, and it would also means literal translation as well. Okay, so keep by paraphrasing, a literal translation means that paraphrasing would be what the translator wants explain understand by the text, and literal would be the actual what the writer, the poet wrote. Okay, so you keep both in mind. The literal translation, a blend of literal translation, that is what the actual author or the poet said, and paraphrasing would be what the translator understands. So this is a blend of both which he comes up. So the description of his own translation approach then bears resembles, somebody wants joined to the definition of imitation above. I may presume to say I have endeavored to make Virgil speak much money. Then he himself justifies, and then he says that it seems something like this, that I may presume to say that I have endeavored to make Virgil speak such English as he would himself have spoken if he had been. So, so much so, he gives his own explanation, says, and he says that the way I have translated Virgil's Aeneid into English in this jargon, it would be something, it's almost like making Virgil speak in English as this was his, as if he would have done if he was in England, which he actually was not. So what it means was that he says that naturally, as a translator, Dryden as an English translator, using his own concept, using his own, expertise in English language, the way he translated it, he says obviously the translation would be something of Virgil. It would be, if you could say that, as if Virgil was himself present and he knew English, and he would be talking about in this way himself. He was born in England, okay, and in the present age as well. So in general, therefore, Dryden and other writings on translation at the time are very prescriptive. Now I move on to this concept that the word prescriptive means that Dryden and the other two translators on whose works I'm going to follow now today in my this lecture, Etienne Dolet and Tytler, these theorists in particular, they were prescriptive in their approach. Prescriptive means as if they were dishing out a kind of, what is prescription? The prescription means anything which is handed to you, that this is the way it has to be done. Isn't it? So when you get a prescription from a doctor who prescribes some medicine for you for any ailment, this is the way it has to be followed in letter and spirit. So this is what Dryden and other translators at that time, they had the prescriptive approach, a prescriptive style, say, or they were giving instructions, or they were giving their theories or points related to translation, the way translation should take place according to them. Okay, because naturally their role, as I said earlier, was in giving a systematic form to the translation studies as it is, or translation studies obviously did develop later on, but translation as it is, in say in 17th century. So Dryden, as I said, had a very prescriptive approach, and same would be the case of other successful translators who would follow him later on. But we have to say that Dryden's writings remain full of language of his time, the genius of the source text author, the force and spirit of original, the need to perfectly comprehend the sense. So we can say that obviously a scholar like Dryden coming up with his own full and his expertise of the language or proficiency. Naturally, his translations would be the work of a genius, and they would be depict the force and spirit. They would probably maybe, if it's not wrong to say, so much perfect they be presented that they would be kind of would be doing would there be more of genius doing than the actual source text author, the way it would be put up in the translation of these writers. Okay, so this was related to the way, as I said, Dryden and his prescriptive approach. Similarly, we are going to move on and we are going to see that other translator or other writers would also begin to write their principles on translation after at the, about the same time or a bit earlier than Dryden. One of them, similar other writers also began to write their principles on translation. You can, a famous name, Etienne Doulet, in 1540, set out 5 principles for translation. Now, Etienne Doulet wrote in French, and in French language, in his 1540 manuscript for his book, which was in French, and the title was The Way of Translating Well from One Language to Another. He set out 5 principles in order of importance for him. And again, we'll see that his approach would be on the same lines as the way, Dryden has done a kind of prescriptive approach. So for Doulet, the first principle for translation implied the translator must perfectly understand the sense and material of the original author. So this is like 5 principles given, and Doulet said that according to Doulet, the translator must perfectly understand the sense, and material means the content of original author. Then the second is that the translator should have perfect knowledge of it. This is meant, some he's putting, bringing it clearly in black and white that the translator should have a hold of both language, should have perfect language of both languages, source language, and that SL source language and TL target language. Anybody say translating from French into English should be well versed in say French as a source language, and if English to translate it, English as the target language. So you would only be a translator would be doing justice to the work if they are well versed in both languages. Then the third principle for Doulet was the translator should avoid word for word renderings. So, and a prescriptive approach by Doulet as well. He says that it's not necessarily the translator should write word for word renderings or word for word, translating each and every word. Next is the translator should avoid Latinate and unusual forms. And when you're translating, say, words from Latin or Greek, you should avoid use of those words or expressions which are particular to Latin language, and some unusual forms as well, which belong to these classical languages, Latin and Greek. Try to avoid them in the translations, because if you tend to use the same expression or style, it was used, a style of language, used in Latin or Latinate, then it would be confusing. It would tend to become confusing for the target audience for whom you are writing, okay, or the target language. So try to avoid that. And the next was that the translator should assemble and connect words eloquently to avoid clumsiness. So here Doulet stresses that all those words, which the translator is trying to translate, or the text, the way all these words are put together, they should be joined, or there should be cohesion is the right word. There should be proper cohesion in these words, and the overall impression should be that it is something it's an eloquent piece of writing. Whatever you are translating should not give the impression as if it's a disjointed, it's a disjointed piece of writing. There should be some connection, there should be some cohesion, there should be some eloquence. That means making your reading, making that translated version reading very interesting, enjoyable, and a kind of cohesion in which it's an easy reading, it's an enjoyable reading, eloquent. So make this the end product of your translation to become an eloquent piece of writing. Eloquent, I mean, and don't just feel that you are just assembling words together, connecting them, just as I should say, an inexperienced person would do. It has to be an eloquent piece of writing, and so that you avoid clumsiness. Your work should not turn out that it's a clumsy piece of writing. किसी novice ने translation की है, we should always give this feeling that it's done in a this job is done in a quick manner, in an appropriate manner. So let me quickly recap all these 5 points, and then I'll move on. So according to Roulette, these 5 basic principles, which we also say kind of descriptive approach. Number 1 was translator must perfectly understand the sense and material of the original author. And the second was the translator should have perfect knowledge of both SL, that is source language, and target language, because only a translator who is well versed in both languages would be able to do justice to the translation. Then the third is translator should avoid word for word rendering. Okay. And fourth is translator should avoid Latinate and unusual forms with which your English readers are not familiar. So don't use any Latin expressions or words, and try to avoid them. And the last point was that translators should assemble and correct words together eloquently, to avoid any clumsiness and make your translation something that's a beautiful piece of writing to be enjoyed and to be read. So here again, as we see in these 5 points, the concern was to reproduce the sense and to avoid word-for-word translation, but the stress on eloquent and natural target language form was noted. So the focus, the last point, is in fact, the main, should I say, the main line, or gives the clear-cut messages. The translator should assemble and link up words together eloquently to avoid any clumsiness. So word-for-word translation is not to be avoided, but stress on eloquent and natural target language form should be used, and should be also rooted in a desire to reinforce the structure and independence of the new vernacular French, because Juliet, I said, wrote in French. So for him, all these 5 points, what he is talking about is in terms of translations from, say, classical Latin language or Greek language into French language, because here's, what all these 5 points he's talking about, it's particularly related to in terms of translation into French language. Then we move on and we say that in English, perhaps the first systematic study of translation after Dryden was in the work of Alexander Fraser Tytler. And Tytler's work, particularly in his essay on principles of translation, which he wrote about towards the end. It's 1770, it's almost like the beginning, or end of 18th century, and just very nearing to 18th century, beginning of 18th century. Okay. So rather than Dryden's author-oriented description, right as the original author would have written, had to be known the target, Tytler defines a good translation in target language, reader-oriented. So the basic difference as you move on to Joliet is he, as he just followed the same lines, being giving his views on English translation. So he says that it's his principles on translation were that as Dryden concentrated on author-oriented description, the way it was, and write as original as the author would have done it for the target language. Tytler kind of defines that a good translation should be reader-oriented. So here comes a kind of a different approach, which we will try to make his work distinct from Dryden. That his approach is that he is more concerned about the reader for whom you are translating, that it has to be tilted towards a kind of a target language, reader-oriented approach honi chahiye. So, and he describes in these words that in which the merit of the original work is so completely transfused into another language as to be as distinctly apprehended and so strongly felt by native of the country to which their language belongs as it by those who speak the language of the original. So he explains everything, and he says that for him, the way translation has to be transfused or changed, a text has to be transfused or changed into another language, you have to be clearly kept in mind that, as a native of the country, would belong to speak, or those who speak the language of the original work, make it as close, very close to the people for whom you are translating. For those who speak the language, so that it's for these natives as well, it becomes easier and understandable. So the 3 points which Tytler has given is, and moving on to them. The first one was, he says, the translation should give a complete transcript of ideas of the original. So for him, his three principles was that as a translation should always give a complete transcript or idea, a picture of the original work. Number two was the style and manner of writing should be of the same character. That means the translator who is doing the job of as a translator has to follow the style and manner of the actual writing, source text, source language, and it should be as you're reading the translator, it should be very close in terms of style and manner. And the third is the translation should have all the ease of the original composition. So the way the original text was written, or source language or source text, translator should do this work very honestly, and should this ease of original composition should be present in the TT, that is target text. Okay, so here we say that Atlas' first law also ties with Deulet's first two principles. Here we see certain similarities between these two theorists, Tytler and Deulet, and we say that they have some closeness. They agree, or they have close in the first two principles, and about perfect knowledge of the original being competent in the subject and giving the faithful transmission of the sense and meaning of the author. But somehow Tytler's second law, like Deulet's fifth principle, is dealt with more of the should I say the style of the author and the translator, both identifying their own true character. Okay, so class, with this we have come to the end of today's lecture. This is what I wanted to focus on today. Now I hope if everything is clear. If not, I'll have 5 minutes for you. You can ask me questions one by one if anything is not clear to you. Okay, now it's open. The house is open for any questions. Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I hope you had the handouts with you in front of you. The notes आपको दिए थे. The details were in the notes which I had given to you. You can follow that. Okay. So somebody wants to join. Who wants to join that late? It's almost the end of the class now. Okay. So any questions which you have in your mind, you can just ask me right now. Okay. Okay. Anybody? Any aspect not related? The basic sum total of all this lecture was what Dryden's contribution was in terms of making translation theory in a more systematic, and then we moved on to these two people, Tytler and Deulet's works in particular. How did they contribute to that? Okay. So, class, if there's not any more question, so that would be all. I think I just want to confirm about Irfanullah has just joined. And where were you, Irfanullah, by the way? Do you want me to mark you present now when it's about the class time is to be over? Okay. Irfanullah, are you listening to me? Is Irfanullah here? Irfanullah, I'm talking with you. Okay, I just want to confirm the attendance. Tariq Hussain is not here. Sidra Islam Abbasi is absent. And Rida Zainab is not here. Farheen is not here. Ibadullah is not here. And so that's all. Class, I will
Ma'am, I'm
Ma'am,
present. Actually, I was have an internet issue. That's why I was late.
who was late?
Robina, I was 10 minutes late. I
Who?
wasn't in at the time of attendance.
Okay, no, I did. You have been marked present, Rubina. That's not an issue.
Okay.
I
Ma'am, I
called.
was also late.
Okay, I'm talking about Tariq Hussain. Tariq Hussain is
मैम
not here.
मैं
Where?
मैम तारिक का एक्सीडेंट हुआ है, वो बाहर गया हुआ था तो एक्सीडेंट हुआ है। वो उसने अभी मुझे कहा था कि मैं क्लास ज्वाइन नहीं कर सकता
अच्छा,
क्लास से पहले।
चले, whatever reason. And what about Sidra? Sidra Islam is not here. Okay, and Rida Zainab. Rida Zainab nahi hai. Farheen is not here for today's class. And then is Ibadullah here? Ibadullah. Okay, not here. So, okay, class, that's all. And I just want to share that probably in a day or so, I'll be putting up your names in LMS, and then you would be able to see these lectures. In any case, these are recorded, and this will be also in the Google Classroom. They are there for you to revisit and revise. But as things get more organized, I'll put them all on the LMS as well when your names will be registered. But it's just from this week that we have gone online 100%. So other things will be all put up on LMS from where you can view the assignments or anything. I'll be sharing probably this week a short assignment or so. Okay, so just take care of yourself and revise. And even if you stay at home, don't waste your time. So this is like a new discipline. Please, as I said, concentrate on the actual text